January 18th, 1886. Dakota Territory. The thermometer hanging outside Millbrook's general store read 30 degrees below zero, and the mercury was still sinking fast. Across the prairie settlement, howling winds drove a white maelstrom through the darkness, carrying a cold so intense it sounded like bone snapping. Inside thin-walled log cabins, frightened families huddled around roaring hearths, burning through their precious winter firewood at a terrifying rate. Frost crept steadily across interior log walls. Buckets of well water froze solid despite sitting less than 3 feet from glowing iron stoves. The cold pressed against every wall like an invisible predator, slowly stripping away human warmth. Yet in one single dwelling, half buried in the rise of a prairie hillside beneath thousands of pounds of stone and earth, an immigrant stonemason sat in complete comfort. Jacob Reinhardt wore only woolen trousers and a light cotton shirt, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. The small iron stove in the corner held nothing more than a handful of quiet embers. Outside, the settlement was freezing to death. Inside Jacob's shelter, the ceiling beam thermometer registered a steady, gentle 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Just 6 months earlier, the entire settlement had laughed at him. Experienced builders had called him insane, a foolish foreigner wasting months digging what they called a grave with a stone roof. They warned him he would freeze in a damp hole, or that the weight of the prairie would crush him while he slept. But on this terrifying night, as the worst freeze in Dakota history gripped the territory, the laws of physics revealed the truth. What did this humble stonemason understand about thermal mass, earth shelter physics, and heat transfer that the so-called frontier experts completely missed? How did a structure built from raw prairie stone and dirt outperform every modern log cabin in the territory while burning less than 1/4 of the wood? Before we unlock the forgotten engineering secrets behind his indestructible shelter, do me a quick favor. Hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from tonight. I promise you that the survival techniques and physical principles you are about to hear could save your life during a real-world winter grid collapse. Stay with me until the end, because we will reveal the precise structural measurements that allowed this design to withstand 40 degrees below zero without a single crack. Now, picture this. To understand how this incredible shelter was born, we have to go back to where it all started. Spring 1885. Millbrook Settlement, Dakota Territory. When Jacob Reinhardt stepped off the stagecoach in the newborn town of Millbrook, he carried only a canvas bag of stonemason tools and a worn leather journal filled with intricate technical sketches. The other homesteaders assumed he was just another laborer looking to join the timber crews. Dakota Territory was exploding with growth, and wood frame houses and log cabins were going up as fast as axes could fell trees. Everyone expected the stocky German immigrant to pick up a hammer and help build conventional frontier homes. Instead, Jacob spent his modest savings on a small plot of land on the eastern fringe of the settlement. It was not prime agricultural bottomland near the creek, nor was it cleared meadow. It was a barren, windswept rise with a direct southern exposure. The moment the land deed was signed, Jacob did not go to the lumber yard. He took out a pickaxe and a spade and immediately began digging. He was not digging a cellar for a house. He was digging the house itself. Day after day, under the blazing Dakota summer sun, Jacob carved into the prairie earth. Settlers passing by in their wagons stopped to stare in sheer bewilderment. He excavated a rectangular pit, 14 feet wide, 20 feet long, and 6 full feet deep, into the firm clay subsoil. The rear wall pressed directly into the face of the hill. The side walls were partially cut into the earth and partially built up using heavy, hand-selected stones, dense limestone and yellow sandstone that he hauled by hand from an exposed river quarry 15 miles south. To the homesteaders of Millbrook, this was absolute madness. The Great Plains were famous for unpredictable, brutal weather. Settlers believed that safety lay in building high above the ground, using thick timber walls and steep wooden roofs that could shed heavy rain and snow. They viewed the earth as something dirty, damp, and cold, a place for graves, root cellars, and animal burrows, not human habitation. To truly understand why the settlers were so shocked, we have to examine the brutal reality of frontier cabin construction in the 1880s. The standard American log cabin was a symbol of rugged individualism, but from a thermodynamic perspective, it was a structural disaster. Consider how a traditional log cabin was built. Homesteaders felled green timber, mostly pine, cottonwood, or spruce-cut notches at the corners, and stacked the logs horizontally to form four walls. Because green logs contain high amounts of moisture, they began to dry out, warp, and shrink the moment they were placed. This shrinking created large horizontal gaps between every single log. To fill these gaps, builders used a process called chinking and daubing. They stuffed the cracks with wood chips, moss, straw, or mud, sealing it over with a crude mortar made of clay and sand. But Dakota winters are famous for extreme thermal expansion and contraction. As winter temperatures plummeted, the green timber contracted sharply, while the clay mortar dried, cracked, and flaked away. By midwinter, every conventional log cabin was riddled with hundreds of microscopic air leaks. These leaks triggered a destructive thermodynamic process known as convective cooling. When a family lit a fire in their central stone fireplace or cast iron stove, the air inside the cabin warmed up. Warm air is less dense than cold air, so it rapidly rose toward the high, peaked ceiling. As it rose, it created a low-pressure zone near the floor. This draft pulled freezing outdoor air directly through the cracked chinking near the base of the walls. The result was a continuous, uncontrollable draft. Near the ceiling, trapped heat sat uselessly 10 or 12 feet above the floor. Near the ground, ice-cold air pulled in from the outside, rushed across the floorboards. A family sitting by the fire might have faced a scorching hearth temperature of 90 degrees Fahrenheit on their front, while their back froze against a 30-degree wall. Furthermore, wood is an insulator, not a thermal battery. While thick timber slows down the rate at which heat moves through a wall, it has very low density and minimal thermal storage capacity. A wood frame wall cannot store heat. The second the fire died down in the middle of the night, the thin wood walls quickly lost their heat to the howling wind outside. Within 1 hour of the fire burning out, the interior temperature of a conventional log cabin would drop to match the outdoor temperature. The winter of 1884 to 1885 had already proven how deadly these conventional cabins could be. During a brutal 3-week freeze in January of 1885, half the settlement fell severely ill with pneumonia and severe bronchitis. Families were forced to take turns staying awake all night, throwing heavy logs into glowing stoves every 90 minutes just to keep the interior temperature above freezing. Women stuffed extra wool rags and old blankets into the wall cracks, but the relentless prairie wind blew them right back inside. Firewood piles that took 4 months of back-breaking summer labor to chop and haul were completely consumed in less than 30 days. Livestock froze inside drafty wooden barns, and families were reduced to burning their own fence posts and farm tools just to stay alive until February. Yet, despite this horrific experience, the settlers of Millbrook refused to question their traditional building methods. They believed that the extreme cold was simply an act of God, an unavoidable hardship of frontier life that had to be endured with grit and heavy blankets. When they saw Jacob Reinhardt digging his 6-foot deep trench into the earth, they did not see an innovator solving a scientific problem. They saw a crazy foreigner who did not understand the American West. Here's what everyone missed back then. Jacob was not guessing. He was relying on centuries of proven European masonry science that had been refined over generations in the cold mountain valleys of Central Europe. He looked at the vast, timber-scarce prairie of Dakota Territory and saw an abundance of two powerful, free, and indestructible building materials: stone and earth. As summer turned into autumn in 1885, Jacob's digging phase ended, and his structural masonry began. And that was when the settlement's skepticism turned into outright ridicule. By late July of 1885, Jacob Reinhardt's construction site had become the main attraction in Millbrook settlement. Every afternoon, farmers, shopkeepers, and local tradesmen gathered along the edge of his earthen excavation, leaning on wooden fence posts and shaking their heads in utter disbelief. Jacob paid no attention to the audience. Working systematically under the relentless prairie sun, he mixed thick batches of lime mortar, using crushed limestone, fine river sand, and water hauled from the creek. Then began the back-breaking task of laying stone. He did not build flat, vertical, wood-framed walls. Instead, he lined the excavated clay pit with double-thick masonry sidewalls built from heavy river limestone and coarse sandstone. Each stone was hand-chiseled to fit snugly against its neighbor, laid with careful overlap to eliminate continuous vertical joints. Where the masonry met the undisturbed clay subsoil, Jacob packed a dense 6-inch layer of dry gravel to serve as a subterranean drainage channel, preventing groundwater from ever contacting the interior walls. Then came the feature that sparked the most intense public mockery: the roof. While his neighbors debated whether to cover their conventional cabins with sod strips or split cedar shingles, Jacob was assembling a wooden framework known as centering, a temporary, curved timber structure designed to support stone until an arch can support itself. Over this arch framework, Jacob began building a massive barrel vault spanning the entire 14-foot width of the structure. Piece by piece, stone by stone, he laid hand-carved wedge-shaped stones, known as voussoirs, in a continuous curved pattern from the side walls toward the top center. Each block was checked with a homemade wooden plumb bob and angled level. The barrel arch rose slowly overhead like the ceiling of a medieval castle dungeon. Samuel Cartwright, the settlement's most respected builder who had constructed 17 wooden cabins across 3 western territories, stood at the pit edge nearly every morning with his arms crossed over his chest. Cartwright shouted down into the hole with the unshakable confidence of a practical man, "You're wasting your time, German. Stone arches are for bridge abutments and church cellars, not homes. The moment you knock out those wooden supports, gravity is going to take over. That entire roof will collapse right onto your head, crushing you instantly under thousands of pounds of rubble." Jacob paused his mortar trowel, wiped sweat from his brow, and looked up at the experienced builder. "In my grandfather's village in Bavaria," Jacob replied in his thick, measured German accent, "stone root cellars have stood for over 200 years. Wood rots, Cartwright. Wood shrinks, wood burns, and wood leaks. Stone remembers how to hold itself. When stone compresses, it grows stronger with age." Cartwright laughed loudly, looking around at the gathered crowd for approval. "This isn't Bavaria, son. This is Dakota territory. We have frost heaves here that will crack 6-inch masonry like glass. And even if that arch doesn't fall on you, living 6 feet underground means you're living in a frost pocket. Cold air sinks. You'll be sleeping in a frozen puddle, while the rest of us stay warm above ground." Others joined in the chorus of condemnation. Reverend Whitmore, the town's circuit-riding preacher, stopped his horse near the dig site one Sunday afternoon and pronounced the project an offense against nature. "God built men to walk upright beneath the open sky. Jacob, living under 2 feet of dirt like a groundhog or a badger, is an abomination. Man was not created to burrow into the earth." Martha Pritchard, a widow whose husband had died of lung fever during a drafty cabin winter, warned Jacob about moisture. "You're building a damp grave, Jacob Reinhardt. Earth is cold and wet. Those stone walls will weep water from October to April. You'll wake up every morning with ice on your blankets and damp rot in your lungs." Even those who felt genuine pity for Jacob tried to talk him out of it. Henry Calloway, a neighbor who lived a quarter-mile down the trail, offered to help him build a standard log cabin instead. "Save yourself months of back-breaking labor, Jacob," Calloway urged. "If you want insulation, just build a normal cabin and pile dirt around the outside logs. Why dig yourself 6 feet into the dark earth?" Jacob simply smiled, thanked Calloway politely, and went back to work. By late August, the moment of truth arrived. The stone barrel vault was complete. It stretched 20 feet long, rising to a gentle peak 8 feet above the excavated dirt floor. At the apex, Jacob drove home the final stone, the keystone, a massive, carefully wedge-shaped block of limestone that locked the entire arched ceiling into continuous structural compression. The stone arch was 18 inches thick at the crown and widened to 24 inches where it rested on the massive sidewalls. A crowd of 30 settlers gathered around the site, On the morning Jacob announced he would remove the wooden centering supports, many came expecting a disaster. Samuel Cartwright stood near the front with his hands in his pockets, a smirk on his face, ready to say, "I told you so." Jacob stepped inside the shadowy stone tunnel with a heavy iron sledgehammer. He set the head of the hammer against the timber wedges, holding up the wooden centering framework, and struck a heavy blow. Knocking out the wedges allowed the temporary wooden frame to drop 3 inches away from the stone vault. The crowd outside held its collective breath, waiting for the catastrophic crash of falling masonry. Nothing happened. The stone arch settled less than 1/16 of an inch, as the massive blocks locked tightly against one another in pure structural compression. The thousands of individual stones were no longer separate rocks. They had transformed into a single indestructible monolithic vault. Jacob walked back out into the bright sunlight, carrying his hammer, and quietly began hauling wheelbarrows of dirt. To complete the shelter, Jacob did something that made the settlers gasp. He shoveled 2 full feet of dense prairie sod and clay directly on top of the stone vault roof. He carefully graded the earthen mound, so it sloped gently away from the center, creating a subtle green rise on the hillside that blended seamlessly into the surrounding prairie landscape. From the outside, his home looked like nothing more than a natural grassy hill, interrupted only by a south-facing wooden entryway, 2 small southern windows fitted with thick glass and heavy oak shutters, and a simple stone chimney pipe protruding through the turf. By October, as the first autumn frosts turned the prairie grass golden, Jacob was treated as a social pariah. Homesteaders stopped inviting him to communal barn raisings. Mothers warned their children to stay away from the strange German's dirt house. When he walked into Millbrook's general store to buy flour and coffee, conversation ceased, and people stepped away from him. He was the crazy immigrant who lived like an animal beneath the earth. Unfazed by the isolation, Jacob focused on his interior finishing. He installed a small, cast-iron wood stove, not in the middle of the room as most cabin builders did, but in the far northeast corner, tucked neatly against the thick stone wall. He constructed a stone chimney that rose through the earth roof, incorporating 3 interior masonry baffles, zigzagging smoke flues that forced hot exhaust gas to travel back and forth through heavy stone before escaping outside, transferring nearly all of its heat into the building's structure. He built a wooden sleeping platform elevated 18 inches above the dirt floor. He carved 2 low ventilation channels near the southern floor entrance and 2 high exhaust vents near the ceiling vault, creating an adjustable airflow system. And then, he waited for winter. Stay with me here, because what Jacob had actually constructed was not a crude dugout at all. It was an engineering marvel that functioned on thermodynamic principles that modern architecture would not fully quantify for another century. Here's the cold, hard truth that Samuel Cartwright and the frontier builders completely failed to understand. Heating a shelter is not about heating air. Air is a terrible medium for heat retention. Air expands, leaks out of cracks, rises to useless ceiling peaks, and disappears into the wind within seconds. True thermal comfort is achieved by managing thermal mass and controlling temperature differentials. Let's decode the physical mechanics that made Jacob's earth shelter so extraordinarily efficient. First, consider the principle of deep ground thermal stability. The earth beneath our feet is a massive thermal damper. While surface air temperatures fluctuate wildly between 80 degrees Fahrenheit in summer and 40 degrees below zero in winter, the ground temperature just 6 feet beneath the surface remains nearly constant year-round. On the Dakota prairie, 6 feet deep into the subsoil, the Earth stays at a stable 48 to 52 degrees Fahrenheit regardless of what is happening on the surface. Think about that for a second. When a severe winter blizzard hits and the outdoor air plunges to 30 degrees below zero, a conventional surface-built log cabin is fighting an 80 to 90 degree temperature differential. The warm interior air inside the cabin is desperate to escape into the freezing ambient air outside, pushing through every cracked log joint and thin window. Jacob's shelter, on the other hand, was wrapped on 3 sides and across the entire roof by earth that remained at 50 degrees Fahrenheit. His shelter was not fighting a brutal 90-degree temperature difference. It was managing a tiny 15 to 20 degree difference. Even with no fire lit inside the space whatsoever, the surrounding soil temperature guaranteed that the interior would never ever drop below 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Second, consider the concept of thermal mass storage, often called a heat battery. Jacob's stone vault ceiling and double-thick stone sidewalls contained approximately 8,000 pounds of dense limestone and sandstone. Stone possesses high specific heat capacity and high volumetric density. It absorbs heat energy slowly, stores it deep within its molecular structure, and radiates that heat back out into the room extremely slowly over a period of many hours. When Jacob lit a small fire in his corner stove, heat did not simply warm the air and escape up the chimney. Heat radiated outward into the 8,000 pounds of stone walls and ceiling vault. The masonry absorbed this energy like a dry sponge absorbing water. Once the stone was charged with heat, it acted as a massive radiant panel, continuously emitting long-wave infrared heat downward into the living space, long after the wood fire had burned down to cold ashes. Third, consider the aerodynamic convection loop created by his structural arch and corner stove placement. In a flat-ceilinged cabin, warm air rises and gets trapped in sharp upper corners, creating stagnant zones of hot air while the floor remains freezing cold. Jacob's smooth, curved barrel vault eliminated dead air corners entirely. Warm air rising from his northeast corner stove hit the curved ceiling, traveled smoothly along the stone arch across the room, cooled slightly near the southern windows, descended gently down the south wall, and moved back across the floor toward the stove. This created a continuous, slow-motion passive convection siphon that distributed uniform warmth to every single square inch of the living space, without creating a single draft. Fourth, consider the moisture control and ventilation physics. Martha Pritchard had warned that an underground shelter would weep water and create damp rot, but she completely overlooked the physics of relative humidity and warm stone surfaces. Condensation only occurs when warm, moist air touches a cold surface that is below the dew point, like a frost-covered log wall in a drafty cabin. In Jacob's shelter, because the heavy stone walls were constantly warmed by the corner stove and insulated by the surrounding 50-degree earth, the interior wall surfaces were always warmer than the air dew point. Moisture could not condense on the walls because the stone was dry and warm to the touch. Furthermore, Jacob's adjustable ventilation system utilized natural thermal buoyancy. Fresh, cold prairie air entered through the low southern intake vent, passed near the base of the stove where it was immediately warmed, expanded, picked up human respiratory moisture, and drifted up toward the high-ceiling exhaust vent. The air inside stayed as crisp, clean, and dry as a mountain autumn morning. Fifth, and finally, consider the total volumetric efficiency. A conventional log cabin with a high-peaked roof containing 12-foot rafters created nearly 3,000 cubic feet of interior volume that required constant heating, two-thirds of which was empty, useless space above the human living zone. Jacob's barrel vault peaked at exactly 8 feet, just enough for comfortable standing headroom, reducing his total heated volume to less than 1,400 cubic feet. By eliminating unnecessary cubic feet of airspace, Jacob cut his fuel requirements in half before he even lit his first match. The only person in the settlement who began to grasp the brilliance of Jacob's design was Daniel Calloway, the 17-year-old son of Henry Calloway. Daniel was studying civil engineering through a mail-order correspondence course from Chicago and brought a paper notebook and a thermometer to Jacob's shelter in mid-November. Daniel walked around the interior, taking temperature readings at the floor, the walls, and the ceiling vault, scribbling calculations in his ledger. "It's like the entire building is a gigantic thermal battery," Daniel said, his eyes wide with excitement. "You aren't burning wood to heat the air, Jacob. You're using wood to charge the stone walls, and the stone walls are keeping you alive." Jacob smiled and patted the smooth, dry limestone wall beside his table. "Exactly, Daniel. Your neighbors think about heating air. But air is foolish. Air escapes through the smallest crack, and air cools down the second the wind blows. I heat stone and earth. Stone is patient. Stone remembers." Daniel ran his thermal calculations based on wall thickness, soil insulation values, and surface exposure. He estimated that Jacob's earth shelter would require less than one-third of the wood fuel consumed by a conventional log cabin of the same floor area. "You have to show these numbers to the town council, Jacob," Daniel urged. "If people built like this, nobody would ever freeze on the prairie again." Jacob shook his head softly. "They will not listen to numbers written on paper, Daniel. People only listen when they are cold. Winter is coming. Let winter teach them." January 15th, 1886. The brass barometer hanging outside Millbrook's General Store had been dropping steadily for 3 consecutive days. Old-timers who had spent decades on the Great Plains walked through town with grim, tight expressions that made younger homesteaders visibly nervous. The winter sky took on a strange, eerie, metallic quality, a heavy shade of bruised slate that seemed to press down directly onto the frozen prairie. Birds disappeared entirely from the sky. Even the ever-present prairie wind seemed to draw a deep, cautious breath and fall dead silent. Clayton Morris, a hunter who had survived 18 northern winters, stood on the porch of the store and pointed a gloved finger toward the northern horizon. "A big one is coming," Morris announced quietly to the gathered men. "I've seen these signs twice before. We're about to get hit by an Arctic polar vortex. The temperature is going to drop to 25, maybe 35 degrees below zero, and it's going to stay there." Panic rippled through Millbrook settlement. Homesteaders rushed to prepare their properties with frantic, desperate energy. Men spent 12 hours a day swinging axes, splitting extra cords of firewood until their arms trembled with exhaustion. Women jammed old wool rags, straw, and dried mud into every crack between their cabin logs. Children hauled buckets of water from the creek until their fingers turned blue, trying to fill indoor barrels before the water supply froze solid. Inside the settlement's 12 conventional log cabins, families battened down like sailors preparing a wooden ship for a hurricane. At Jacob Reinhardt's earth-sheltered dugout, preparation looked completely different. Jacob did not spend 12 hours chopping wood in a frenzy. Instead, he took a spade and banked a few extra wheelbarrows of moist prairie earth around his south-facing wooden entrance frame. He checked the iron baffles in his stone chimney and cleared out a small layer of wood ash from beneath his corner stove. Then, he brought inside a total of 10 logs, not 30 or 40 logs like his neighbor Samuel Cartwright was hauling, but 10 carefully selected dry logs of seasoned hardwood. Samuel Cartwright drove his heavy wooden wagon past Jacob's site, loaded to the brim with split pine logs. Cartwright pulled his team of horses to a stop and looked at Jacob's tiny pile of fuel with genuine disbelief. "Is that all the wood you're bringing inside, German?" Cartwright called out, shaking his head. "That tiny pile won't last you 2 days in an Arctic blast. When the wind hits 30 below, you'll burn through those 10 logs in 6 hours, just trying to keep your fingers from freezing off." Jacob leaned on his shovel and looked at his neighbor with calm eyes. "It will be sufficient, Samuel," Jacob replied softly. "My stone holds the heat. Your cabin lets it escape. Store your wood carefully. You will need it." Cartwright snorted, whipped his horses, and drove off, convinced that Jacob's arrogance would be his downfall. The storm struck on the night of January 17th with biblical fury. It did not begin with a slow build-up. It hit like an iron fist, smashing across the open plains. First came a blinding curtain of heavy snow, falling vertically through motionless air. Then came the wind, a screaming Arctic gales that picked up the snow and transformed the prairie into a deafening white maelstrom. The temperature plunged with terrifying speed. At 6 o'clock in the evening, the outdoor thermometer read 15 degrees above zero. By 9 o'clock, it had dropped to 10 degrees below zero. By midnight, it registered 22 degrees below zero. And by 4 o'clock in the morning on January 18th, the mercury hit 30 degrees below zero and stayed locked there, as 60-mile-per-hour winds howled across the plains. Inside the settlement's conventional log cabins, the battle for human survival began in earnest. Every fireplace and cast-iron stove was stoked to its absolute maximum limit. In Samuel Cartwright's cabin, his large stone fireplace roared night and day, burning massive pine logs every 2 hours. Yet despite the raging inferno, the thin wood walls and cracked chinking, proved completely helpless against the freeze. By 2 o'clock in the morning, a thick layer of white frost had formed on the interior surface of Cartwright's log walls. A bucket of well water, sitting just 6 feet away from the blazing fireplace, developed a solid 1-inch skin of ice. The interior temperature in the far corners of his room dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit, while directly in front of the open hearth, the air was a scorching 70 degrees. "Throw on more wood," Cartwright shouted to his eldest son through the clouds of wood smoke filling the cabin. The boy threw 3 heavy logs into the firebox. The temperature rose briefly, but as soon as the wood burned down, heat poured rapidly up the chimney flue and escaped through hundreds of microscopic cracks between the shrinking wall logs. Across the settlement, the exact same tragedy played out in every traditional home. The Hensley family burned through an entire week's supply of dry firewood in less than 36 hours. The Pritchard family moved their children's bedrolls to within 4 feet of their cast-iron stove so close that their woolen blankets began to scorch and smell of singed fabric, even while the backs of their heads felt ice cold. The Calloway family watched in terror as moisture from their own breath condensed against their northern timber wall and froze into intricate, jagged ice ferns inside their living room. Trees outside cracked open with deafening reports that sounded like gunshot fire as internal sap froze and expanded. Drafty wooden barns collapsed under the pressure, and livestock froze where they stood. Now, picture this. Inside Jacob Reinhardt's earth, sheltered dwelling, a completely different world existed. Jacob slept peacefully through the entire storm, waking naturally at his usual hour of 6 o'clock in the morning on January 18th. The screaming prairie gale outside was reduced to a soft, distant hum beneath 2 feet of prairie earth and 18 inches of heavy stone. Jacob stepped out of his bed and walked across the wooden floor in his stocking feet. The floorboards were comfortably warm beneath his feet because they rested above clay subsoil that remained at 50 degrees Fahrenheit. He glanced up at the thermometer hanging from his central ceiling beam. The mercury registered a steady, comfortable 63 degrees Fahrenheit. The small fire he had lit before going to sleep had completely burned down to a few quiet coals. Jacob reached into his pile, picked up 2 hardwood logs, and placed them gently onto the embers. He did not move in a panic or a desperate rush. He moved with the easy, measured confidence of a man following a simple routine. His interior stone walls were bone-dry and warm to the touch. The heavy stone barrel vault overhead functioned exactly as designed, acting as a massive, radiant umbrella that continuously bathed the entire room in gentle, long-wave infrared heat. There were no drafts, no frost ferns on the walls, and no clouds of smoke in the air. Jacob dressed in his normal indoor clothing, a pair of wool trousers, a cotton shirt, and a light knit vest. No heavy fur coats were required inside his home. He filled an iron pot with fresh water, set it on top of his corner stove, and prepared coffee. He sat in his handcrafted wooden chair and opened his Bible, reading by the warm light of an oil lamp while enjoying a breakfast of hot porridge. Outside his door, the prairie wind was blowing at 60 miles per hour, in a killer freeze that would have destroyed an unprotected human being in less than 15 minutes. Inside, Jacob Reinhardt sat in his shirt sleeves, enjoying 68 degrees of stable heat while burning barely 4 logs a day. By the morning of January 19th, the brutal polar vortex had entered its 36th hour. At 9 o'clock in the morning, a heavy, desperate knocking sounded at Jacob's southern wooden door. Jacob stood up, lifted the heavy oak latch, and opened the door. Standing on the threshold was Samuel Cartwright. The settlement's master builder looked completely broken. His face was gray with exhaustion. His eyes were red-rimmed from wood smoke, and his hands were raw and blistered from splitting frozen pine logs in the blizzard. He had been awake for 36 hours straight, fighting a losing battle against the freezing cold in his drafty cabin. "Jacob," Cartwright rasped, his voice trembling from exhaustion and cold. "I need to borrow firewood. My family is freezing. We burned through our entire 2-week wood pile in 48 hours. My hearth can't keep the room above 40 degrees. I'll pay you back double come spring. Just give me wood." Jacob did not say a word. He opened his door wide and stepped back, gesturing for his neighbor to enter. "Come inside, Samuel," Jacob said softly. "Step out of the wind." Samuel Cartwright stepped down into the Earth-sheltered space, and what he experienced in that moment changed his understanding of shelter for the rest of his life. A wave of genuine, gentle warmth rolled over him, not the blistering, dry blast of an overfired stove that scorched your face while leaving your back cold, but a uniform, deep, enveloping warmth that felt like an early autumn afternoon. Behind Jacob, illuminated by the soft light of a lamp, the interior looked like a haven of peace and comfort. The stone walls were bone dry. The ceiling vault radiated steady heat. The air was crisp and fresh. Cartwright looked up at the ceiling thermometer hanging from the wooden beam. The mercury read 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Cartwright stared at the glass tube, then looked down at Jacob's corner stove. The small stove held a modest, glowing bed of embers. There was no roaring inferno, no mountain of firewood, no smoke, and no panic. "How?" Cartwright whispered, sinking onto a wooden bench as his frozen hands began to thaw. "How is this possible? My cabin burned 46 logs yesterday, and we almost froze to death. You have barely touched your wood pile, and your house is warmer than my summer parlor." Jacob walked over to his small slate board, picked up a piece of chalk, and drew two simple diagrams. "Sit, Samuel," Jacob said gently. "Drink some hot coffee, and let me show you the physics." Jacob pointed to his slate diagram of a conventional log cabin. "Your cabin is built entirely above ground, Samuel. Outside, the air is 30 degrees below zero. Inside, you want 60 degrees. That means your thin wood walls are trying to fight a temperature difference of 90 degrees. Heat is energy, Samuel. Heat always flows from hot to cold, as fast as it can. The bigger the temperature difference, the faster your heat flees through your walls and up your chimney." Jacob then pointed to his drawing of the earth shelter. "My shelter is buried in the hillside. 6 feet beneath the snow, the earth stays at 50 degrees Fahrenheit all winter long. My shelter is not fighting 90 degrees of difference. It is fighting a tiny difference of 15 degrees against the earth. The soil protects me from the wind, and my 8,000 pounds of stone vault holds the heat like a giant battery. You heat air, Samuel. Air escapes. I heat stone. Stone remembers." Cartwright looked from the chalk diagram to the dry limestone wall beside him, then placed his trembling palm directly against the stone. The wall was warm, genuinely warm to the touch, radiating stored energy accumulated over days of steady firing. "Let that sink in, Samuel," Jacob added quietly. "Yesterday, during the worst of the Arctic blast, I burned 6 logs. You burned 46. Your wood went up your chimney as wasted smoke. My stone kept my heat inside." The mathematical reality was indisputable. In terms of total thermodynamic fuel efficiency, Jacob's earth shelter was operating at more than 700% better performance than the best log cabin in Millbrook. By noon on January 19th, word spread across the settlement. Homesteaders who were running out of firewood began arriving at Jacob's door not to borrow wood, but to see the miracle for themselves. Margaret Hensley came, wrapping her children in wool blankets inside Jacob's warm space. Martha Pritchard arrived, astounded to find that the subterranean room was completely dry, with 0 wall condensation. Young Daniel Calloway brought his father Henry, clutching his engineering notebook. Even Reverend Whitmore arrived, humbled and shivering, stepping inside the underground shelter he had once called a groundhog burrow. Jacob welcomed every single one of them. He brewed hot water for tea, pulled out extra benches, and turned his home into an impromptu classroom. He walked them through the principles of thermal mass, subterranean temperature stability, passive convective air loops, and proper stone vault masonry. For 6 hours, while the blizzard raged uselessly on the surface above, the citizens of Millbrook sat inside Jacob's earth shelter, learning the forgotten engineering secrets of traditional European building science. It was, in effect, the very first green architecture and off-grid engineering seminar in Dakota Territory history. When the families finally returned to their cold cabins that evening to tend their fires, the mockery was gone forever. The dismissive laughs had vanished. Jacob Reinhardt was no longer the crazy German who dug his own grave. He was the man who had conquered the Dakota winter. The bitter polar freeze finally broke on January 22nd, 1886. Temperatures climbed slowly back to 10 degrees above zero, a temperature that felt almost tropical to the exhausted settlers after 5 agonizing days of Arctic cold. As families emerged from their smoke-filled cabins to assess damage, clear snowdrifts, and count their remaining firewood, the final statistics of the storm became crystal clear to everyone in Millbrook. The numbers did not require interpretation. They spoke with brutal mathematical certainty. Over 5 days of extreme Arctic conditions, Jacob Reinhardt's earth shelter burned a total of 24 logs. His interior temperature never dropped below 58 degrees Fahrenheit and never exceeded 70 degrees. The structure suffered 0 moisture accumulation, 0 wall frost, and 0 structural strain. Jacob slept 8 hours every single night, worked comfortably on hand tool projects, and experienced 0 cold-related physical stress. In contrast, the average conventional log cabin in Millbrook burned 187 logs over the exact same 5-day period. Their interior temperatures fluctuated wildly between 38 degrees and 62 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on how close you sat to the fire. 2 conventional cabins developed dangerous structural cracks in their corner timbers due to violent thermal contraction. 1 cabin roof partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow. Nearly every family suffered minor cases of frostbite, severe sleep deprivation, and respiratory illness from heavy smoke inhalation. By late March of 1886, as the spring thaw turned the prairie clay soft, 7 new earth-sheltered dwellings were breaking ground in and around Millbrook settlement. Samuel Cartwright, completely setting aside his professional pride, became Jacob's very first masonry apprentice. Together, Jacob and Samuel designed an expanded family-sized earth shelter for the Pritchard family, a 22 by 32-foot structure featuring double stone sidewalls, a heavy stone barrel vault, and a second corner stove. It was capable of housing a family of 6 in total comfort, while consuming less firewood than a small single-room timber cabin. Young Daniel Calloway documented every single phase of construction. His engineering correspondence course evolved into a practical thesis titled Earth Shelter Construction in Extreme Climates. Empirical data from Dakota Territory. Daniel measured wall thermal performance, calculated soil insulation coefficients, and mapped structural load distributions across arched stone vaults. As years passed, homesteaders who built earth-sheltered homes discovered incredible benefits far beyond thermal efficiency. The structures were profoundly, beautifully quiet. The thick earth blanket absorbed all ambient sound. Families who had grown accustomed to hearing every terrifying prairie windstorm shake their wooden cabin walls now slept in complete, undisturbed silence. Children relaxed, and family illness rates plummeted as stable indoor temperatures eliminated constant respiratory stress. The earth shelters were also remarkably storm-proof. When a devastating tornado touched down 15 miles south of town in June of 1887, it completely pulverized 2 conventional wood-frame homesteads. The earth-sheltered homes sitting directly in its path suffered 0 structural damage beyond torn grass on their earthen roofs. The occupants, sheltered beneath thousands of pounds of stone vaulting, barely realized a tornado had passed directly overhead. By 1892, 34 earth-sheltered dwellings stood within a 50-mile radius of Millbrook. In autumn of 1889, a journalist from a major Chicago newspaper traveled to Dakota Territory to document what he called the underground settlement. His article, published in November of that year, was titled Frontier Wisdom: How Prairie Settlers Rediscovered Ancient Building Secrets. The journalist interviewed Margaret Hensley, asking her how it felt to live inside an earth shelter after years in a traditional cabin. Margaret's response captured the ultimate lesson of the entire experience. "We came west thinking our modern timber cabins were superior to old ways," Margaret told the reporter. "We built what looked proper and conventional, and we nearly froze to death for our own arrogance." Jacob Reinhardt taught us that primitive does not mean inferior. Sometimes, primitive simply means proven by thousands of years of human experience. When the reporter asked Jacob if he felt vindicated by the town's total transformation, Jacob shook his head with his characteristic modesty. "I do not feel vindicated," Jacob replied softly. "I feel relieved. For 3 generations, my family built with stone and earth in Bavaria. These techniques kept people alive through centuries of harsh winters, wars, and hardship. I simply trusted what I was taught by my ancestors. The lesson is simple. Never assume that because an idea is old, it is obsolete. Old means tested by time. Old means it survived when fragile ideas failed. Jacob Reinhardt lived in his original earth shelter until 1903, when he constructed a larger subterranean home to accommodate his growing family. County land records show that his original 1885 stone vault dugout was still standing strong in 1920. Its stone arch intact, its interior dry, and its structural integrity unchanged after 35 harsh Dakota winters. Modern architecture and off-grid engineering owe an incredible debt to pioneers like Jacob Reinhardt. Modern building studies confirm what Jacob knew intuitively. Earth-sheltered construction in cold climates reduces space heating and cooling costs by 60 to 80% compared to conventional above-ground construction. We now have modern vapor barriers, reinforced concrete, and advanced insulation materials. But the core engineering philosophy remains entirely unchanged. Work with the natural thermal capacity of the Earth rather than fighting against it. Store heat energy in dense thermal mass. Minimize the temperature differentials you must overcome. Build for the real climate you have, not the ideal climate you wish you had. Jacob Reinhardt's true legacy is not just the stone shelters he built or the families he saved during the Great Freeze of 1886. It is a timeless lesson in survival and humility. Dismissing traditional wisdom as primitive reveals not the ignorance of our ancestors, but our own. Sometimes, the most advanced survival technology on Earth is simply remembering what we should have never forgotten. Before you go tonight, if this story changed the way you think about off-grid building, heating physics, or traditional survival wisdom, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now and leave a comment below telling me what traditional building technique or forgotten wisdom you think modern society should revisit. Stay warm out there, stay safe, and remember, sometimes digging down into the earth is the smartest way to rise above the storm. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current building codes and safety guidelines.